Okay, everyone can see. And let me. Okay. I'd like to thank you for the invitation to come and share the results of a project that I started a couple of years ago when I was the researcher in residence at Concordia University Library. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the project that I began then and how it's developed since as well. Okay. It wouldn't be a conference presentation if there wasn't a meme. So I'm going to tell you both how it started and how I was able to use the researcher in residence program as a springboard for success and tell you how it's going now. You'll see that it's developed quite a bit, started small, it's grown a lot. It wasn't always a straight path to get here. That's what makes research so interesting. And, sometimes surprises take us in new and fruitful directions. So even though it wasn't a direct path, that's not necessarily a bad thing. The reason that I initially proposed this project was because I have noticed an increasing linguistic diversity on campus. My regular day job is as a professor of translation, so I'm very interested in language and linguistics. And of course, universities like Ottawa and Concordia have already got linguistic diversity in the sense that we're universities located in very bilingual environments. But in the past decade, we've seen an increase, a tremendous uptake in the number of international students coming to universities in Canada and in other English-speaking countries around the world. And we've even seen a situation where universities in countries that are not using English as an official language are beginning to offer programs, particularly graduate programs, in English. So all of these kind of different factors have resulted in a real boom in linguistic diversity on university campuses. And so the project that I started at the researcher in residence program was really to investigate whether this newfound, rich linguistic diversity on campuses could offer an opportunity for academic libraries to teach something that I'm calling machine translation literacy. And when I talk about machine translation, I basically mean programs like Google Translate or DeepL, these kind of free online systems that allow you to take a text in one language, plug it in, click a button, and voila, you have a text in another language. Not necessarily a great text, but a text in another language. So that's what I mean by machine translation, essentially Google Translate and tools that are similar to that. Now, while Google Translate is a relatively recent tool, was first released in 2006, so just 15 years ago, machine translation is actually a very old technology. It goes back, it was one of the earliest applications actually of computers, so back to the 1940s. And a lot has changed in the 70 years since machine translation was first conceived. So 3 things that I'd like to talk about. The first is that machine translation in its early years was pretty much limited to being in the hands of researchers and developers on the one hand, or language professionals on the other hand. So people who had training in translation were the principal users of machine translation. Now, of course, it's available to anyone with an internet connection. So what happens when you take a tool that was designed for someone with a particular professional training and you give it to just anybody? So machine translation's in the wild and people are not necessarily well equipped to use it. So that's one issue, one thing that's changed in the kind of landscape of machine translation. Another thing is that, sometimes we have this idea that technology is complex, very sophisticated, and hard to use. We've all, kind of struggled to learn new computer programs. We've had to plow our way through the 150-page user manual to try and figure out how it works. Well, machine translation is the opposite to that. It's super easy to use, and the worry for me is that it's a little bit too easy to use. When something is really, really easy, we can approach it on sort of autopilot and not necessarily be critical in how we're using the tool. So machine translation is so easy to use that we are tempted to just not really think about it, just do it without thinking. And the third thing that I want to comment on quickly is that the underlying approach to machine translation has changed. Back in the early days, in the 1940s and 50s, computer programmers were essentially trying to imitate the way that people processed language. So they were programming these systems using a lot of linguistic knowledge, grammar, with huge dictionaries. And so it was a linguistic-oriented approach. But what we've seen over the years, and particularly quite recently, is that there's been a radical change in the way we approach machine translation. Linguistics is kind of like out the window, and now it's a data-driven approach, an AI-based approach that basically does number crunching and pattern matching and machine learning. And so linguistics is not a factor anymore. We need to understand how this technology works in order to understand the problems that it has. So one of the things that I used to like about the old style of machine translation was that it was easy to recognize as machine translation. It produced what we might call translation ease. We had errors that were kind of, clunky, awkward. It was kind of easy to spot that a text had been produced by a machine translation system. And so knowing that it had been produced by machine translation, it kind of put us on alert, right? We know that machine translation is not perfect, and so we were ready to kind of treat it with care because it was a machine translation. What we see in the data-driven approaches is that the text now sounds good. It sounds plausible. It's quite fluent. And so the alarm bells don't ring for us. It sounds good, so it must be right. The problem is that it's often containing meaning errors disguised in good writing. So we no longer are on alert the way that we used to be with that old, really obvious, clunky, awkward translations that used to be produced. So those are three things I think are important because they represent a significant change for the machine translation landscape. So where does that leave us? Machine translation is easy to access, it's easy to use, and it's got a higher quality than it used to. Again, not perfect, but better. But all of these things don't necessarily mean that we know how to use this technology wisely. And so I have come to the conclusion that people need to develop machine translation literacy. And I know that I'm talking to a crowd who understands this because librarians are already experts in digital literacy and information literacy. So this is kind of the vein that I'd like to sort of frame machine translation literacy as a sort of type of digital literacy that we need today. And like digital literacy, machine translation literacy emphasizes critical thinking. It's not really about learning which button to push. As we already established, that's super easy. But it's more about being a critical thinker. Not how do I use this tool, but should I use this tool? What should I use it for? When is it a good choice? When would another translation approach be a better choice? So I'd like to help students develop their machine translation literacy so that they could be more informed and critical users of this technology, instead of being in that autopilot mode where they're not really thinking, they're just clicking. So As part of my time at Concordia, I had the opportunity to work with people from across the campus, and then I continued back home in my home university as well. So this was really a team effort, and I had a few research assistants who joined the project, two of whom were international students, so that was great. They were able to bring that perspective. And I also was able to work with the International Students Office and the Graduate Student Success type centers and the continuing education group who are responsible for the English as a second language courses. So this was really a team effort, and it was so helpful to have input from all of these different perspectives. And together we were able to come up with a sort of framework of the type of information that we were teaching in a machine translation literacy workshop. So initially, we proposed it as just a sort of hour-and-a-half workshop. So you're not walking away as an expert on machine translation, but hopefully able to pick up some tips about how to be a little bit of a smarter user of this technology. So just to give you an idea, one of the things that many people found surprising and valuable to learn was this idea that when you enter something in a machine translation system, it doesn't just disappear when you close the window. The underlying terms and conditions of a company like Google, for example, allow them to keep your data and to reuse it for other purposes, which, one of the main purposes is training their machine translation system. But the terms and conditions are actually quite broad as to what they can take and do with your data after you've entered it. So that's quite a surprise to a lot of students. They hadn't thought of that issue of privacy or confidentiality. In an academic context, university context, of course, academic integrity is something that's also quite important. The idea that you can take something from another, from a work and repackage it in a new language, just because you change the words doesn't mean you don't have to reference it anymore, right? If you're taking an idea, even if you're expressing it in a new language, you still have to do proper referencing and citation. One of the underlying things about the data-driven approach to machine translation that I mentioned is that it basically learns what we teach it. And one of the things that Google has actually been in trouble for a little bit is the fact that the data that they have used to train their system has a lot of bias in it. Gender bias is one of the obvious ones that has come out. So some languages don't use gendered pronouns like he or she that we have in English. They might have a gender neutral pronoun. So Turkish is one example of a language with a gender neutral pronoun. But when you translate from a language that has a gender neutral pronoun into a language where you have to pick a pronoun, what happens? Well, it was really interesting to note that when the pronoun was used with a word like engineer or doctor, the system was picking to translate the gender neutral pronoun into a masculine pronoun. Whereas when it was associated with a word like nurse, then it was choosing a feminine pronoun. So that was kind of evidence that the material that was chosen to train the machine translation system was itself not gender neutral. It was sort of gender biased. So it helps to understand how these systems work in order to be able to spot this type of problem that's coming out of the system. So these are just a few examples of some of the things that we packed into our workshop. And another fun one is the idea of garbage in, garbage out. Students did not really consider the fact that a machine translation system would do a better job with a well-written source text than it would with a kind of poorly written source text. When people think about improving machine translation, they tend to instinctively think about improving the output. But one of the best ways to improve the output is to improve the input. So again, just another tip that was there for the students to learn at this workshop. So what happened at the workshop? Let me see. On the big day, that's me at the front crying my eyes out because only 2 people came to my workshop. The big launch day. So you're probably all laughing at me, but remember that I'm a professor and I'm used to having a captive audience. So for me, when I prepare something, I expect the 30 students who are registered in the course to show up. So this was upsetting and shocking to me, although I have to say the 2 students who came were fantastic. And so we were able to kind of use it almost like a focus group or a, kind of pilot. And they gave really good feedback that helped us tweak it. And so then I went hunting in search of my captive audience so that I could test it on a larger scale. And I connected, as I mentioned, with the groups that do English as a second language. And that was a great way for me to test it. And I ran the workshop once at Concordia and once at Ottawa U, both times with a group from the ESL. And, a very diverse group within that class. So it was good to get lots of different perspectives. They had different native languages. They were studying different subjects, and it was very enriching to get their feedback as well. If you look just at the right-hand column, essentially the average of those groups, one said, I learned new things in the workshop. Almost 80% of the students were happy with that. They felt that they could use MT a little more confidently. They felt that they would perhaps use machine translation more now that they understood more about it. They knew when would be good times to use it and not. And for the most part, they said that they would definitely recommend it to someone else. And some of them were interested in learning more. Some said, okay, this was good. I think I've gotten what I need. And a few of them were interested in learning more. So that was a kind of encouraging to me that it did seem to be something that was worth doing. And then COVID. So everything changed in COVID, and I didn't do any more workshops through the library because I was very busy, as everyone was, just trying to scramble to do the absolute necessities. But I did have an opportunity to design some new undergrad courses. And one of them in particular, I think was quite exciting for me. I was able to participate in what's called an interdisciplinary course. So I teamed up with a professor who teaches library and information science, and we designed a course on new literacies for the information age. And I also taught a course on translation for non-translators. So these were 2 other good places where I could pilot this module. Obviously, it wasn't the whole course on machine translation literacy, but there was a module on this within those courses. So I got to test it with even more students, almost 150 to date. And these students come from programs across the whole campus: engineering, education, law, everything. And they also, while the majority of them are either French or English native speakers, we also had lots of international students. So again, a really good testing ground for this idea. What did the students say? Well, one thing that I think is important to note is that people do use machine translation. We can pretend that they don't, but they do. We can tell them not to, but they will. So I don't think there's a lot of point in forbidding this technology. Better to help them use it in a smart way. They are using it. Where do they use it? They use it in many aspects of their lives. They use it for their studies, but also at work and even for leisure activities. So quite a diverse type of use of machine translation. I asked them, of the 7 elements that I covered in the workshop, which was the most surprising element to them. Most of them were not aware of those privacy issues. So definitely something I think worth telling them about. Also, quite a few hadn't realized the potential for bias. And also, a lot of people think that Google is the only tool out there, or that all tools are identical. So they weren't even aware that there are different tools, and different tools work better for different languages or different subject fields. So I still think that there were quite a few things for these students to learn. I asked them if they thought machine translation literacy was important. Now that they knew about it, did they think that it was important? And most people said yes, either moderately, very, or essentially important. And very few people said, no, it's not worth knowing about. So that was encouraging to me. And the final question I asked was, should the university teach machine translation literacy to everyone? Should we make this information available very widely? And again, I was quite happy to see that the majority of people felt that, yes, this was something worth knowing. And so that is that gives me hope that I'm not barking up the wrong tree completely. What I'm going to end with, though, is a sort of observation that it's a little bit of a paradox. And again, maybe people from the library science world are going to laugh at me, but like I said, I'm used to having a captive audience. And often I teach actually compulsory courses, not even electives. So really students have to come to my classes. But what I noticed is that if we offer things to people as an option, they might not take it because they don't actually know that they need it. But when they do kind of find themselves in a situation where, I don't want to say it's forced on them, but they do learn about it, then they're happy that they learned it. So I'm kind of looking to, hopefully in the discussion period, to get your advice, because I feel like you might have more experience than me with this. How do you help people to realize what they don't know and what they need to know, especially in the framework of information literacy, digital literacy type stuff? So my conclusion is that maybe the library turned out not to be the best place to situate the workshop, but definitely the Researcher in Residence program was a key to letting me develop and test this idea. So I'm really, really grateful for that program. And I just want to say that I think it's a very forward-looking thing that the Concordia University Library has organized. And I'm pleased to say that I was able to leverage this pilot project to get some funding. So I'm definitely going to continue the project, looking more at how machine translation can play different types of roles in the scholarly communication world. And so if anyone has feedback or suggestions, I would love to hear about them, because the project is definitely continuing in albeit a slightly different form. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Lynn. We now have a few minutes available that we'd like to open it up for questions. So please feel free to raise your hands or enter them in the chat, and we can make sure that Lynn hears them. Thank you.
Sorry, is that Evan? I'm looking at a couple of screens open here.
Yes. Hi, Lynn. It's Evan Sterling from Ottawa. Good to see you. Just wondering if you were to propose kind of making this mandatory or part of the core curriculum for a large segment of students, how do you think you would kind of go about doing that? Because from what I know, like there are a lot of these kind of cross-functional skills that different people would like to teach students, and it's a big challenge to find kind of space in the curriculum against all these other competing desires.
I agree with you. I don't have the answer. This course that I taught this past year with a professor for information studies, we did it as part of what's called interdisciplinary arts courses. And the idea is that these courses change every year. So we pitched this idea and it was sort of taken up for this year, but next year it'll be on something else. And, some other professors will do it. So I agree with you that there's a set of core skills that we expect all students to have, and yet we don't actively kind of ensure that they're part of a core curriculum. So I would be advocating, I guess, for all students to have to take some kind of introduction, kind of like introduction to university type course. But that means giving up space in the curriculum for something else. And that's where you kind of run into resistance, because unfortunately, if we only just keep adding to the curriculum, we'll end up with a 10-year degree program that nobody wants to commit that amount of time to. So I don't have an answer, but I I recognize the problem as you do. And, we rely a lot on services like the library to cover some of these core skills. But the problem is that it's optional. So often the students who really need it are the ones who don't take it. I'm just looking in the chat. Have I considered a workshop for graduate students in the humanities who may need to work with texts in languages other than their area of expertise? Yes, so that was my original idea, was to run workshops for graduate students. And in the end, more undergraduates than graduates came. So I was a little bit surprised by that. I do think, though, that there's a market. It's just a case of where and how to advertise it. And I think that's where I had pinned my hopes on the library as being a kind of cross-cutting unit. But then I don't know, I don't think it was a lack of advertising, but it could just be a case of finding the right time. The problem with a lot of information is that students want it at the time that they need it, which is not necessarily at the time when the workshop is offered, right? They're not necessarily thinking ahead that they might need it, 6 months from now, or they, need it after the workshop's over and they didn't register. So it's very difficult. It's this kind of, we need this sort of just-in-time delivery of information, but everyone's time is different. So yeah, I feel like I'm not answering the questions, but I'm agreeing with the observations of what the problems are. Can you access the course unit workshop materials somewhere? I'm working on it. I have a website, although it's not fully developed yet, but I'm definitely willing to share. So don't hesitate, Marta, to get in touch with me, and I will share what I have. And it more and more is going up on the website all the time. The privacy angle might be a good way in. If it was part of a larger privacy in the digital age curriculum or something similar. Yes, privacy is definitely the area where people sort of, I think, hadn't made a connection between, machine translation, privacy. It's not the most immediate type of connection that they could make. They're thinking about machine translation and language, machine translation and subject matter, text type. Yes, so I guess, again, the courses that I know about that focus on privacy are courses in information science, in communication, but these are students who need it even, if they're studying education, or if they're studying engineering, or if they're studying biology. So it's almost too broad. It's much easier to market things that have a very narrow target market, as opposed to trying to reach a very, very wide public and help them to realize why it's relevant to them. Yes. Will I be creating a fancy online module for just-in-time delivery? Yes, I will. That's part of the funding that I got from the SSHRC grant, is to create a video. So that's kind of in the pipeline, that we're going to be working on creating a nice, hopefully, video tutorial that people can access in their own time when they need it. Yes. Machine translation literacy is closely related to information literacy. Yes, it is. Excellent. I'm glad to hear that it is helpful to someone working in information literacy. I think it's related to both digital and information literacy. So it fits very well in the world of information science.
Okay. This is a great discussion, and Lynn, thank you very much. I think we're going to have to wrap up here for the next presentation, but thank you very much for your presentation.